Well, hello, everybody. This is Youth Ministry Programming 207, Lecture 2, which is actually on creativity. Uh, why think about creativity? Why talk about this? Well, in ministry, it's always helpful, I think, to take something and spin it a little new way, present it in a manner that makes it refreshing and new, and engages the audience in some new way. I asked a class on campus recently to think back at the most memorable sermon they have heard recently, and they really struggled to think about a sermon. And they've heard lots of sermons, but they hadn't heard necessarily a memorable one. Finally, a student said that what crossed their mind was the pastor of their church once every 3 months does a first-person monologue where they play a character from some biblical story. And it's always engaging and interesting, a little humorous. People look forward to it. It takes a lot of work to do that, but it's a creative approach to preaching, and often it's difficult to do that, particularly if people don't feel that they're very creative in what they do. I've always thought with youth ministry, there's an expectation that we're going to be creative, and people are creative at different levels, but I found that the key to creativity is often not how naturally blessed you are for that, but how hard you work at it. I like the magicians Penn and Teller. I saw an interview with them a few years ago. They've got this amazing, interesting program that they present every year and tour with. And in the interview, they said that in the article, they said they spent a month every fall just working on ideas and magic concepts and things. They said it was a lot of hard work. So they come off as very creative, but it's not like they just, comes off on the spur of the moment. They work hard at it. After my youth ministry years as a middle school pastor, I spent the decade of the 90s doing youth events, mainly middle school events. We had a company I formed with a friend of mine who had left Youth Specialties for us to start this, and I was leaving my church at that time, about 92. My partner in this enterprise was a guy named Todd Temple. He was known at Youth Specialties and a lot of parts around the country as one of the more creative minds. And indeed he was. Todd was known as a guy who, just amazing thoughts would just roll off his head in meetings and things. But what I found being his partner was that he worked hard at being creative. A couple examples that I remember once being at his apartment out in San Diego. We were working on our program, our business, and I was shocked to see on his coffee table, which was actually a lobster trap, as I recall, there was a Guns and Ammo magazine, and Todd was about as anti-violence as anybody I knew. He didn't want anything violent going on. I said, "What are you doing with the Guns and Ammo magazine?" He said, "Well, Focus of the Family asked us to work on a program for some of these stadiums for teenagers, and trying to figure out how to shoot a T-shirt across a stadium. You've seen this many times since, but I know, 15, 20 years ago, I'd never heard of anybody doing that. It was kind of amazing and kind of cool, the idea. So he figured, where else you learn about how to shoot things across a stadium without hurting somebody? And he went to Guns and Ammo magazine. I mean, he went to read a magazine he normally would never look at to try and figure out how to do something, how to solve a problem. I saw it in our business once with him also, where he called me from Las Vegas and said, "I found a machine we have to buy." And we were at the time, we were overwhelmed with our debt load and trying to make the business go. And I said, "Okay, well, what are you doing?" He said, "Well, I'm at the National Radio Broadcasters Convention." And I thought, what are you doing at that? He says, "Well, I go to this every year. I have for years." He says, "I also go to the National Consumer Electronics Show to get ideas and to try and figure out what I can learn from, technology and whatnot, and see how it applies to ministry." And so the machine he had seen was a little sound processor called the Eventide Ultra Harmonizer. Guitar players know it well because they use it for changing sounds on their guitars. Radio people know it because they use it in the studio to change voices. We've all heard radio ads and identity call letters with a deep voice or something happening, and that's a sound processor. And Todd thought, "I want to apply this to a live event," which we did. We ended up buying this little machine, And we just had a blast with this thing all around the country, because at these middle school events, we would have a microphone out in the audience, and during funny parts of interviews, people telling stories, and junior high kids talking about what's up. We would, someone would talk live in the mic, and then coming out of the speakers was a completely different voice. So you might have, I remember a huge youth leader. The guy was 300 pounds plus, cool dude. And, he got the mic, and then we hit the button for Alvin the Chipmunk, and out of his mouth comes Alvin the Chipmunk live, what he's saying. Then a little girl, 6th grade girl, gets on the mic, and just a little tiny thing, and Jabba the Hutt's voice comes out. It was amazing. Well, this came from, not because Todd dreamed up this machine. He went someplace to discover something out of his comfort zone, his normal area of interest. And that's how a lot of creative ideas come to fruition. They don't come because someone just sits and thinks and ponders, hopes for an idea. It comes because they go outside of their, we always say outside the box. It really is. It's to go out and see something in a place they haven't experienced before, and to try and figure out how that can connect with what they're doing in a new and fresh way. And it's great in ministry. We just have to force ourselves sometimes to go places and to be in a different environment so that we think fresh about programming. And that takes some work, but it's a great idea to be able to do that kind of work, to be creative. And just as a little further note on my former partner, when we ended our business in the late 90s, I kept doing youth events, and eventually I came to Eastern to teach. And Todd, because he'd always been frustrated in our events, how hard it was to play video and put things on a screen as quick as you could do it. He always kept thinking, I can't wait till computers can do this more quickly. And as computers got stronger and faster, he embraced that, and he actually created a software product that maybe some of you have used. It's very common in churches, called MediaShout. And he wasn't a software writer, he wasn't a programmer, but he had the idea for what MediaShout should be able to do, and create a business to do that. That came from, again, different areas coming together in one thing, where he saw what the possibilities could be. To further chat, or emphasize this idea, good to think of just historically on some of the great inventions. I think about your cell phone or your smartphone, most likely, although there's a couple of you that probably still have some flip phone out there. Just so you can, it's actually cooler to have a flip phone sometimes these days. But most of us have smartphones. No one just dreamed up a smartphone one day and said, I'm going to make this a telephone that you can talk with and you can access the whole world of knowledge. And that became, because somebody combined cell phone with computer technology and the internet and miniaturization to be able to come up with these amazing little machines we have. The cell phone itself didn't just come out of nothing. It came from researchers in laboratories trying to figure out how to make things wireless. They had to embrace things like radio frequency technology, to broadcast from a tower to tower that way. It wasn't cell phone towers yet; it was just radio towers. And this goes all the way back to people trying to communicate, to figure out how can we talk long distance. The telegraph was invented when someone figured out how to embrace electricity in a different way through wire, to ring a bell at the end of the wire. And then Bell, of course, himself, he figured out, many people were working on this, but Bell figured out how to take what he knew about, because his field was actually teaching deaf people to talk. He understood voice frequencies, and to figure out a way how to do that through a wire, and create an end product the same as what was sent down the wire. So this is how communication is, how we got a smartphone. It didn't start with just a brilliant idea. It started with a lot of ideas, and a lot of time as people combined ideas into something new. So when you're trying to do a youth ministry program, and you're trying to figure out how do I make this creative and different, you got to work at it. You got to try hard and try and come up with a way that you can make this a unique a unique idea that's going to capture kids in a new way. A lot of us have been to youth events where we watched maybe some dramatical presentation or something creative. I watched one of my former students at his church in Maryland, and back in May, I watched him, do a painting on stage that took form as he painted. There's people who do that for a living. The Jesus painter does that one. It's wonderful. It's creative. It's different. I could never do it. I can't draw to save my life, but I could maybe find someone else to do that who does artwork. Find somebody in my congregation or volunteer that maybe do something along that line. But it's as you're telling a story, those painters, they're portraying this a picture that's taking shape, very memorable and very engaging. Same thing with drama and theater. Sketches, things along that line, where we're taking maybe a story, and we've all done this to try and take a Bible story and tell it in a contemporary manner, and it's very, very memorable. I remember one time at a retreat we had years ago, there was a play that our high school students had put together, and the youth minister for the high school group was saying, can we come to the camp and put this story on? And we thought, well, sure, we could fit that in. They had no idea what an amazing, moving story this was going to be in about a 15 or 20 minute little dramatical presentation. It just kind of blew kids away, just confronted them with all kinds of things, because it was called Broken Heart, as I recall, and it had to do with an apple representing this one student's heart. And, that apple gets tossed around and torn into and cut up a little bit, and very, very painful sometimes to watch, but very moving, because it's different than just saying, hey, we all have broken hearts. But in the way it was presented, it got kids thinking and responding, considering something biblically that was going to be could impact their lives a little bit. This idea of combining different areas to create something new, by the way, is in an article that I will post along with this lecture called "A Whack in the Side of the Head," and I recommend reading it. There's no quiz on it or anything, but I think it's helpful. I think you'll find it interesting, where the author talks about how to do this very thing. So even now, as you start maybe thinking about a Bible study that you'll put together for this class project, I'll give you a lot of freedom on what passage to pick. That way, if it fits what you're teaching with your group, I think it'll be helpful for you. Obviously, if you can be doing that for your own context, which should be practical and helpful. But it'd be good that you figure out that passage early and start thinking about some creative angles on what you might do with that, particularly in terms of engaging ideas that might bring kids into the topic and get them thinking or interested in what you're going to do, what we would call either the preview or hook, which we'll get to later on the practical Bible study ideas. So good to be thinking about how you might do that. So for example, sometimes as you look at a passage and you think, we're always in the same place where we study this, and think, well, let's see, like around our church or someone's home, wherever you meet, where could you go that's a little different that might make the story fresh? If you're doing that classic story where Jesus' friends the paralytic's friends let him down through the ceiling to get healed by Jesus, maybe there's a roof you can go up and sit on. Probably not take it apart. You might get in trouble for that one, but maybe you do that study up on the roof somehow. That's kind of thinking in a new way. Be looking at what kind of what music pieces might fit to this. What children's story may speak to this? I'm amazed how a few years ago I memorized a Dr. Seuss book. I had trouble getting to Solace Salou, and I've done that story from smaller children up to older adults. Everyone loves Dr. Seuss, and yet the point of the story, it was powerful, and everybody's glued to the story because there's nothing like Dr. Seuss rhyming that is just so engaging. So, find ways to try and think, how can I make this more creative? What character in the story, assuming there's a character that I can teach in a different way that might be fresh and unique? What setting could be different? There's just a lot of different ways to kind of do that. But if you don't think of yourself as a creative person, you're gonna have to work extra hard at this. But how can you find ways to communicate so without going back to kind of some of the same old youth ministry ideas? There are classic games and activities that everybody uses in youth ministry, but sometimes it's nice to get beyond, say, like the human knot, which is wonderful and great and can be useful. But is there a better way to teach something about community or problem solving than using the human knot all the time? Might be something out there. Now, I have found over the years that part of what helps me try and be creative is to make sure I have a process and a system in place. So for example, you can do this with your phone nowadays. I used to always have to carry a little notepad and a small pencil to write down anything that crossed my mind that I thought I could use. Because sometimes you'll see a billboard or something, and you'll think, oh, what a great idea, or what a great slogan. I'll use that later. And then an hour later, you can't remember for the life of you what it was you saw. With the phone, of course, fortunately, because someone invented a smartphone, combining telegraph and internet, you could just type these little, type into your phone and try and remember that. But file ideas, be thinking ahead all the time and looking around, be observant and looking for creative ideas. I also think it's really helpful to have a process, like what I like to do with storyboarding. I don't know if you're familiar with storyboarding. I'll try and find a link for a little storyboarding example that can be helpful. Years and years ago, Imagineers at Disney did a lot to develop the storyboarding idea where, to come up with new ideas and create Disney projects from amusement parks to movies. They would have groups of people sit in a room, and they would create ideas, and someone would be recording these on little cards, and then they would be taking the cards and pinning them on a corkboard wall. And then why they like doing that, instead of dry erase didn't exist when they did this, but instead of doing like a chalkboard, is you don't have to erase. You're just moving postcards around, and you can start new categories. And the idea was to create ideas without criticizing ideas. So, someone comes up with something just, like, that's so crazy, but it's like, put it down. You never know. Someone might say, well, the best way to teach that was like take all the kids to the space station. Well, of course, you're never going to do that, but you put it up on the thing because someone else might say, why don't we create what it's like to be in the space station for this study? Which reminds me, by the way, that one of my students a few months ago for a Bible study in a class, and we were trying to come up with creative ideas, and he went and asked our astronomy professor if he could use the planetarium on our campus for his Bible study. And the professor thought it was fabulous. And we met up there and had our study. And I mean, it was cool. It was really, really great. And I talked to the professor afterward, and I said, I was kind of surprised that you allowed him to do that. And he said, in 35 years, he said, no one has ever asked me that. I thought it was a great idea. And other students were a little jealous, I think, because it was just such a great idea to go like, why not do, a passage where we're looking at shining the stars in the universe in a planetarium that's on our campus, right? So anyway, a little sideline there on that one. But I think the storyboarding approach is to get you to put, ideas and be able to brainstorm. I use storyboarding a lot. My office has 2 walls that are corkboard, and I'm putting things up there all the time. I plan what courses we're doing for a few years. I plan ideas. I put, we a couple years ago, we had a huge report to write to justify our major and our existence and what we're doing. And all that went up on my board, and I kept changing. I get an idea, and I put another idea up on the board, and shaped the whole report we did on my storyboard. I'll have to put a picture of that up as well. So, I like those I like having processes in place that are going to be ways that we actually are intentional about how we get creative, rather than just thinking, give me a creative idea, God, please, I need something, but to work hard at it. And so that might, for this class, even though we only have a few weeks, probably a good idea to be thinking about not just the Bible study, but the retreat project. what creative angle can I do on this retreat? I'll close with one little story. I remember when I was high school minister for a couple of years at my church, we were trying to come up with this discipleship retreat. And, I was looking around some different camps. Everybody was kind of full. It was middle of November, difficult to find something. And I'm kind of on a whim. I don't know. I guess I probably saw something in the paper about the ski season beginning. I ended up somehow I connected with the Marriott in Vail. Now, I was a Colorado Springs youth worker, so I was out in Colorado. And Vail Marriott, the week before ski season opened, gave us the most ridiculously great rate. That was even 20 years ago. It would sound good now, the rate they gave me, because it basically was 5 kids in a room for $55. And had house service. They cleaned the rooms for us every day. And they threw in a suite for me and my family that was the governor's suite. And it was so big that there was 70 some high school students in this. We had breakfast in the governor's suite every day, and people were like, how do we do this? And how do we do it so cheap? And I thought, well, because I'm a genius creative guy, well, not quite that great, but it was fun to be thinking outside about, instead of doing a retreat at a retreat center or a camp. And I don't know how you are, but I mean, I love camps and they're wonderful, but there's sometimes when the last memory at a camp is trying to get rooms clean. Or you can't find something. Someone stole something. I remember getting stuck one time. We had a group up renting Frontier Ranch, great young life camp. And someone had stolen some pool balls. And we couldn't find them. We weren't leaving, Well, so the last hour is complete negative as we're trying to find the stolen the goods. At the Vail Marriott, our last memory was like, pack up and go and don't worry about cleaning your room. They're going to do it for us, They gave us a great meeting room to be in. I mean, it was just kind of a cool thing for a high school group to be in such a wonderful place. A week later, the rates would have been about 5 times what we paid. So just thinking outside a little bit, to be getting out of the lines, stepping over the border, some pretty good ideas there. So be thinking early on about some of these things. What can I do to think creatively about this? It might even be involving other people to help you do this, so that you are getting other people to give you some direction on this. But so a little bit there about creativity. I just think in youth ministry, it's a great thing when we add creativity, engages students, becomes memorable. It tugs at emotions in new ways that aren't predictable. I think it's a good thing for ministry in general, but particularly in youth ministry, to be trying to think as creative as we can get.